Welcome to the Research at Citi podcast. I'm your host, Elise Badoy, and I'm head of UK, Europe, Middle East and Africa Equity Research at Citi. I'm delighted to be recording from New York today, and I'm joined by Monique Pollard in London, who's our head of European Retail, Internet and Brands Research, as well as Filippo Falorni, who covers US Beverages, HPC research based in New York. This podcast is obviously going to look at the upcoming World Cup and how, it will impact various sectors in the global economy. Filippo, to start, can you just discuss why you think football this summer is relevant to the consumer space and to the potential consumer reach of the event?
Yes, Elise. Thanks for having me on. And look, finally, the real football, as I like to call it, soccer for Americans, is returning to North America for the first time, really since 1994, which was the last time that the U.S. hosted the event. And last time Mexico hosted the event was 1986, and this one is going to be a joint tournament between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. To put in perspective the relevance of the event, this is the most watched sporting event globally. 2022 edition was followed by 5 billion people worldwide, and 1.5 billion people globally watched the final. So clearly the scale and reach is extremely elevated. And then in terms of the 2026 event, you will have 48 teams, which is an expansion for the prior 32 teams from the 2022 tournament. And so you have 104 matches compared to 64 matches last time. And 72% of the matches will be played in the US, with the remaining in Mexico and Canada. So what we did in terms of ways to analyze the potential impact across the consumer group, we looked at with Citi Global Consumer Team and Citi Innovation Lab at serving 1,800 people in 7 countries, the 3 host nations, as well as countries in Europe and Latin America where soccer fans are extremely passionate. And so one of the key takeaways from our survey was that engagement levels are pretty elevated. 97% of consumers that responded to our surveys plan to engage with the event in one way, shape, or form, whether it's watching the game on TV or streaming, engaging through social media, or 20% of respondents, they plan to watch the game live. So this is clearly a significant outreach, and a lot of companies are planning to clearly market around it. And so when we think about it, there's a lot of different opportunities across different sectors, which I'm sure we'll talk more later, Liz.
So obviously, we have the pleasure of Monique as well on the podcast, and you cover European sportwear brands, retailers. So presumably the World Cup is an important event for them as well. Can you just sort of give us a little bit more detail here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Elise. So, obviously, as you say, it represents a really unique commercial opportunity for a lot of the global sportswear brands and the retailers. I guess I'd break down that commercial opportunity into 3 parts. So, the first is the sort of short-term commercial opportunity in the lead up to the games around selling jerseys for fans of respective teams and the match footballs. So if you think about that, it's really Nike, Adidas, and Puma that have most of that market tied up. So of the 48 different teams that are participating, 37 of them are sponsored by those 3 brands, and they represent the most likely teams to win if you look at the latest Kalshi offers as well. So then the second opportunity is really around getting your sportswear brand in front of that North American consumer who is becoming increasingly interested in what they would term, I guess, soccer. Clearly, that's not something you can precisely quantify, but it is very important to have your brand, on the front foot in the largest global sporting goods market in the world. And then the third opportunity, which is a little bit more, of a potential or subjective, is around the potential for football to become a growing lifestyle trend for consumers. So we're starting to see, from a fashion perspective, an increased presence of football inspired footwear and apparel worn for those kind of fashion purposes. So, you see these shoes that now have the football uppers with a normal street shoe sole. And again, don't know, how material this could be, but it does represent an interesting third commercial opportunity for the brands.
Thanks, Monique. Filippo, walk us through implications across food and beverages companies, please.
Yeah, so we believe the World Cup will be a pretty significant marketing activation and consumption opportunity for many food and beverage companies. One thing we asked in our survey was around expenditure expectations. The average respondent in our survey planned to spend an additional $115 per week on food and drinks compared to a normal month of spending. And that's even higher in OS countries. So where in OS countries, the average respondent is $134 per week. And when we looked at category consumption, there's a clear winners within each category. So if you look in alcoholic beverages, beer is the clear winner. 64% of respondents, they plan to drink beer as their preferred alcoholic beverages while watching the games. In terms of non-alcoholic beverages, traditional soft drinks, sodas are the real winner with 57% of responders planning to drink soda during the tournament. And then finally in food, not surprisingly, pizza and potato chips were the preferred choices in terms of drinks, in terms of eating while watching the games with your favorite drinks, whether alcoholic or non-alcoholic. Pizza was at 49%, potato chips at 46%. So clearly not surprising, these choices, but the consumers are clearly planning to spend more. And another interesting thing in our survey was that consumers are planning to relax a bit their diets. Some of these categories that are relatively winners are categories that have been a bit out of favor in the US, especially beer, especially salty snacks. And some of it has been GLP-1s and more focus of US consumers on diet and more healthier living. And obviously, as you watch the games, some of those trends tend to be relaxed a bit, which could be a bit of a boost for our companies. And then the last thing I will mention is that there are some brands across all different categories that are global sponsor of the event. And so those are the ones that we believe have a higher propensity to have a bigger boost in terms of spending. Some of it because they're going to be served in the stadiums, but also there's going to be a lot more commercials and a lot more marketing activation. And then lastly, I would also mention brands that have more affinity to parts of the population that are more likely to watch the games, like the Hispanic consumer base. Those are also brands that we think are going to benefit even more within those categories.
So, Filippo, you've just described a summer of fun backdrop being quite a complex geopolitical background, etc. So I think this will be very, very welcome. But then, moving on from the leisurely activities, Monique, presumably a global sporting event like this with such high viewership, we know there's one where we could see a lot of betting activity. And traditionally there is. So how important is this event? Can you sort of quantify the event for the online gaming sector?
Obviously, it should provide a tailwind for industry handle. That's the amount that people actually bet in any given period. And the benefit's probably going to be most pronounced for the host nations of the US, Canada, and Mexico, given things like favorable kickoff time, so more people actually watching the games live. And typically, it's positive for the industry overall. It's not necessarily on an annual basis super material for individual betting companies. This year, I think what the operators are struggling with is that point that Filippo made earlier. You've got 104 matches this time versus 64 previously. So many more betting opportunities. But what it means, particularly in the early stages, is some of those matchups are quite varied, let's say. Now, bookmakers make their money not just by, people betting, but it's also people losing their money ultimately with the bookmaker. So I think what the bookmakers are struggling with a bit is how well the customers are going to be able to do, particularly in the early stages of the matchups versus the bookmakers themselves. They know there'll be more industry handle. Exactly how much of that will come through to them in revenues, less clear. But again, still a good opportunity for them to get activity onto the platform. And then obviously at the moment, one of the big questions in the US in terms of online betting is how much of this activity and this handle is going to be spent on the traditional sports betting platforms versus that gets spent on the prediction market platforms that are on the rise at the moment.
Yeah, definitely a lot of focus on prediction market platforms. Filippo, however, you've also collaborated with the other consumer sectors. What have we missed? Any potential areas that you'd like to highlight, obviously?
Yes, look, there's going to be significant implication for other consumer sectors in addition to the food and beverage increased consumption that we talked about before. First of all, I would say food retail will definitely benefit from increased spending on grocery shopping, especially in the host countries, but also in other countries where people are going to shop more to host parties potentially at home. Another space is also the food delivery space. Some people are going to go to the grocery shop and host a party. Some people are just going to order in as they plan to watch the games at home. Also, the increased consumption in food and beverage should be a tailwind across the supply chain. So think about the packaging companies, especially the can manufacturers, as you're going to see more consumption. Those should also benefit across the supply chain. And then additionally, many people would also watch the games outside of home, right? So think about bars, restaurant industries, especially in the host countries where there's going to be more activities and more activation, but also globally, right? In most countries around the world, football or soccer is the number one follow sport across Europe, across South America. So you're going to see a lot of gathering around the event that should benefit bar and restaurant industries, again, mainly in the host countries, but also globally. And then finally, it's important to mention the tourism industry. Obviously, airline, hotel, lodging. We have over 5 million people planning to travel to North America for the event. I know there's been a lot of discussion around visas and around complication given more restriction from the current US administration, but nonetheless, I think we still see significant amount of tourism, and so the overall industry across US, Mexico, and Canada should see a boost as well.
Thanks, Filippo. Monique, does UK grocery benefit at all from the World Cup? Are those watching at home more likely to be spending on certain categories? I think Filippo sort of gave us a view for perhaps the more US-based consumers in places, but obviously globally. But specifically, when we look at the UK grocery that I know you cover, anything you want to mention there?
Yes, as Filippo mentioned, customers are planning to spend more on food and drink during the tournament versus the normal month, which should be something of a benefit. I think the things to bear in mind are England match timings will be very important. So, if you look at all the potential matchups England could have, depending on how long they stay in the tournament, 3 of the potential matches are on weekends. That's a benefit. Kickoff times are typically between 5 p.m. and 10 p.m. UK time. So, relatively good times for sort of socializing. The weather will play a part. If it's very hot and sunny, people will tend to maybe go out more to the bars and restaurants and watch the matches. If the weather's slightly less good, that could be slightly more of a benefit for the UK grocery, and it will obviously depend how long England stays in the tournament. The final point I just make, though, is some of the categories that people are likely to spend on that Filippo mentioned, particularly things like beer, are relatively low margin for the UK grocers. So there could be a bit of a tailwind to the top line, probably less of a profit driver.
Right. Thank you so much, Monique. Thank you, Filippo. We are looking forward to a summer of fun and football. This episode of Research at Citi was recorded on Wednesday, 3rd of June, 2026. I'm your host, Elise Badoy. See you next time.
This podcast contains thematic content and is not intended to be investment research, nor does it constitute financial, economic, legal, tax, or accounting advice. This podcast is provided for information purposes only and does not constitute an offer or solicitation to purchase or sell any financial instruments. The contents of this podcast are not based on your individual circumstances and should not be relied upon as an assessment of suitability for you of a particular product, security, or transaction. The information in this podcast is based on generally available information, and although obtained from sources believed by Citi to be reliable, its accuracy and completeness are not guaranteed. Past performance is not a guarantee or indication of future results. This podcast may not be copied or distributed, in whole or in part, without the express written consent of Citi. Copyright 2026 Citigroup Global Markets, Inc. Member SIPC. All rights reserved. Citi and Citi and Arc Design are trademarks and service marks of Citigroup, Inc. or its affiliates and are used and registered throughout the world.